We're going to have a very interesting talk on light fields, an overview. What are these light fields? Why are they important to virtual reality? And we have Ryan Damm, who is an expert on light fields, who will be delving into that topic with us. So let's give him a warm welcome, a round of applause as Ryan comes to the stage.
Thanks, Bruce. Cheers, man. All right, well, thanks for coming. Thanks to SVVR for having me. Thanks to Bruce and Carl. This is a lot of fun. Just so I can tell where we're starting here, who here in the room more or less thinks they know what light fields are kind of about? Okay, well, I'm done then. That's great. Then who's totally clueless and wants to start from zero here? All right, well, I'm mostly talking to you people, unfortunately, but maybe there'll be some information for the rest of you as well. So briefly, what we're going to cover. By the way, I think there's a lot of misconceptions and confusion around light fields. It's actually a pretty straightforward concept. We're going to try to cut through some of the misinformation and give you a pretty good foundation of what light fields actually are. So we're going to start out by talking about what I call holographic light fields sort of in normal space outside of cameras. Then we'll delve into the history of light fields and finally come back to, very, very briefly, light fields inside of cameras, which is a little bit less relevant for VR. So, holographic light fields. Really, it's just all the light everywhere, okay? All of the light in a space. Oh, sorry. Forgot about this slide. This is a source of a lot of the confusion, I think. People think of light fields as being about refocusing and stuff. It's really not, and particularly not for VR, okay? Really, light is just, light fields are about all of the light in a space, okay? So for the purposes of this discussion, light moves in straight lines. It's all around us everywhere. And that's really all a light field is. It's capturing all of the light in a space, not a small amount of it. Light fields are effectively part of a planoptic function. All of light in the space has 5 dimensions. If you think of 3-dimensional space having x, y, and z, and then the rays directions themselves having 2 angular dimensions, it's a 5-dimensional light field. To put it another way, x, y, and z define your position, right? And that defines a perspective. If you put a camera or put your eye somewhere, the x, y, z position defines which objects are in front of other objects, and then the 2 other dimensions define where you're looking. So 3 spatial dimensions, 2 angular dimensions, 5-dimensional light field. It gets a little more complicated than that, though, because light is very, very long straight lines. It connects 2 surfaces. So in this case, those 2 rays are actually the same light ray for the purposes of this discussion. What that means is instead of 5 dimensions, it actually reduces down to 4. That's a goat, by the way. So to make this a little less abstract, let's talk about a specific case, a goat, with light rays bouncing off the goat and some observers observing the goat. What we have is a series of light rays that connect all the points on the goat to the observer's eyes. Okay, the observer's eyes define the perspective, and all the light rays passing from the goat to the eyes define what the image of the goat looks like. Okay? Now, if we were to drop an invisible plane somewhere between the two and actually capture all of the light rays that were bouncing back and forth between the 2 sides there, we could actually recreate every possible view of the goat. Right? If you can record it and play it back, you've got a fully holographic view of the goat. You don't need the goat anymore. And that's really kind of the larger point. When we experience the world, we are, with our eyes, we're not seeing in 3D, okay? We're seeing a series of 2-dimensional images that are drawn from effectively a 4-dimensional light field. If you want to sense a goat in 3D, this is how you do it, okay? Vision is fundamentally 2-dimensional, working on a 4-dimensional light field. So this is the big point I want everyone to walk away with. Light fields are holographic, and this is fairly important, okay? It has nothing to do with refocusing. Light fields are holographic. They contain all possible views and all possible perspectives. So we're surrounded by 5 dimensions of light. Light moves in straight lines. We can trace the light back to surfaces, 2-dimensional surfaces, and those surfaces then contain all possible perspectives that pass through them. So 5D down to 4D, and there you go. Now you're all much, much smarter about light fields. Critically, the shape of the surface, and this is what really matters for VR, the shape of the surface doesn't actually matter. It can be a sphere, it can be a cylinder, it can be a box. As long as the observer is looking through the surface and every possible light ray that would hit their eye is represented on that surface, you can recreate that view. So for VR, what this means is if we can create light field boxes, you can put a user inside that box, and now all of a sudden they have full positional tracking and full 360 view. How do we feel about that? Does that make sense? Awesome. Okay, the other thing to know is, of course, if the volume is empty, if you don't have objects in there, having all the light rays on the surface is all you need for all the views. Okay, this is a little pet peeve of mine. People oftentimes conflate holographic or light fields with volumetric stuff. And I think in this case, rather than expounding on it at length, I'll give you about 4,000 words on it, okay? Volumetric models that assume that every point on the surface has a single color will fail for a lot of different subject matter, right? Obviously, this car, for example, right here, depending on what angle you're looking at that car, the color of each point on the surface changes as the reflection moves across the car. Likewise, if things don't actually have a well-defined shape, like the rays of light from behind a tree or light bouncing off the water, volumetric models really fail to capture that imagery correctly. Okay, so another key thing, light fields are holographic, volumetric is not. And of course, I include a revenant there, right? So you can see that specularity is really important for the things we really care about, people's faces and everything. If you wonder why some volumetric video for VR, the people look a little uncanny, it's largely because of that specularity that's not being captured. It's the assumption that the skin is the same color no matter what direction you see it from. So getting this right and moving to light fields is going to vastly improve the quality of VR. Now, a very popular way to capture VR video is with array cameras, right? So let's talk a little bit about what a camera does. A camera is essentially sampling a light field, okay? Just like our eyes are. But critically, they're doing it at a single position. So it's no longer a four-dimensional view, it's a two-dimensional view, okay? That single perspective is defined by that camera's position. So if you have a big ball of cameras, what you have is a series of discrete perspectives, and then you're trying to sort of reconstruct the original light field from those perspectives, okay? Now, if we could have truly native holographic imaging, we'd be one step further along. As it is right now, traditional cameras capture two-dimensional images. We try to stitch them together and make something that looks like a light field out of them with varying levels of success. And here's why. Here's the problem. There can be structure in a scene that falls between two cameras. If you don't capture that structure, if you don't properly see the photons that are falling between your cameras and can't interpolate them correctly, your reconstruction will fail. You try to get positional tracking and things will look weird. And this is one of my favorite images to show it. You can actually see light that's bouncing off the water and hitting that boat there. If you put your head where that boat is and you moved side to side, you would see glimmers and reflections moving along the water in a way that's very, very difficult to interpolate. If you had a camera there and a camera there, you'd have no idea about all this structure in the middle. And that's why dense arrays are kind of the most photographically correct way to grab light fields. Of course, that leads to other problems. So, light fields are holographic. I think this audience at least understands why we should care. I gave this talk to a bunch of filmmakers before this and had to sort of prove that these new display devices are functionally holographic, right? As a user moves around, they have to have new perspectives for each position that they're in. And in order to serve that, you have to have something fundamentally holographic. By the way, we're also getting this on 2D screens. I've seen some interesting demos of multi-perspective panels. So it's not that far off before all your phones and computers and TVs are going to be inherently multi-perspective too. At which point, 2D images are going to look kind of bad by comparison. Okay, so that's holographic light fields outside of cameras. Let's rewind a bit and talk about the history of light fields in like about 30 seconds. Okay, so the Greeks, some Greeks believe that there were these I-beams that shot out of your eye, and that's how we actually saw. Not at all correct. It's actually much more how like video game ray tracing works, right? Kind of fun, but not actually correct. Da Vinci was really working on perspective drawing. He sort of talked about this pyramid of sight that connects lines from the eye to what you see. So we're sort of starting to evolve this idea of light fields. But the first time it was really articulated was actually an English physicist named Michael Faraday. He was working on magnetism, and he sort of described light as vibrations in the ether all around us, which is getting really, really close to the idea. The ether doesn't actually exist, but I sort of like the image of us all embedded in some enormous light field jello mold. And that was the first articulation in like the 19th century. The first attempt to actually capture light fields, though, was first proposed by Gabriel Lippmann, 1908. Never tried to build this, but his idea was to build something that we might today call a microlens array. I think he described it as like a waffle press to make this glass panel. But what it essentially was a holographic camera. And he described how you could calculate the radii you needed to make the proper imaging. It would look something like this. The whole light field would be incident on the front of the panel. Each of those would act like a tiny camera and would focus the light rays onto the film emulsion on the back. Now, of course, they didn't have digital technology in 1908, so this was both a capture and playback device. The idea was you'd then illuminate the panel from behind. The light would pass through the pattern of dark and light that was on the film emulsion and would recreate the original light field. Super clever, super clever. It was not going to work, though, because it actually inverts the light rays. It actually, if they're coming in one direction, turns around and sends it back out the other direction, which have a very, very weird effect. It's called pseudoscopic. It's sort of like if you had your left eye and right eye swapped, all the depths would be wrong, would have been really wacky. So don't go out and try to build that. He had some really interesting ideas, though, around this, what I'm going to call embedding, right? So you've got a four-dimensional light field embedded on a two-dimensional sensor. And the way he does it is each of those little tiny cameras is functionally defining your perspective. It's your XY position. Within each image from each camera, you have the other two dimensions of direction. So it's a four-dimensional image embedded on a two-dimensional sensor. So now we're getting closer to something a little more interesting, right? Now how we can practically capture these four-dimensional constructs. And effectively, this was sort of the first array camera. Never built, wouldn't have worked, but lovely idea. Okay. Those ideas sat dormant for quite a while. They'd pop up in the literature every 10 years or so. But the first time people really started taking them seriously was really with the rise of computer graphics. I'm going to mention just a couple of the big players here. One is Paul Debevec. You really should go watch the talk he gave to it was VES, Visual Effects Society. Just Google it. Upload has a link somewhere on their site. It's a really fantastic introduction to light fields. It's about 50 minutes long, so it's like twice as many jokes as I'm telling you right now. The other one to mention is Mark Lavoie. He had some foundational papers dating back to the early 90s. But the reason I'm mentioning him is that one of his graduate students in 2005 was Ren Ung, who I think you all are familiar with his work. Led to the creation of Litro. Now, this is, of course, the first practical light field camera. But we just talked about holographic light fields. This is not that at all. It's kind of similar, though. In fact, it's similar to the Lippmann camera, right? You've got this array of micro lenses, taking a 4D light field and embedding it in 2D. But it's behind an objective lens. And that's sort of the central rub. This, by the way, is why people think light fields are all about refocusing. And it's sort of that's the central rub. These are, in fact, light fields. And it is, in fact, a four-dimensional image embedded in a 2D raster of 2D images. But the images that you see there are kind of weird, right? It's not like a bunch of tiny little pictures. Well, actually, they are. They're tiny pictures of the back of the lens. And what that means is a little strange. And most people don't pop the back off their camera and stare through the lens. But the image of the back of the aperture of the lens is actually giving you information about where the light rays were coming from. Each single one of those cells is like a cell in the Lippmann array. It's taking a tiny two-dimensional photograph, and you can figure out which light rays came through which part of the lens aperture. That's functionally how a Litro camera works. Again, it's not super relevant to VR, but I think it's important to understand where these misconceptions are coming from. So all of the magic in the Litro camera is basically using the fact that you know the direction of the rays and their location to actually move them around and synthesize new perspectives. That's actually more or less analogous to taking a holographic light field and rebinning them and grabbing different light rays to represent different perspectives, right? Fundamentally, we're just taking two-dimensional slices through this four-dimensional view. And if you've got the correct light rays, you have either a refocused image or you have a novel perspective for a VR user. Okay, how many people have I lost so far? Show of hands. Great, one. Okay, we'll talk afterwards. Okay, so there's some this is all exciting and wonderful, but there's some very, very real problems with light fields. The top three that I can think of are data. We talked about the fact that these four-dimensional arrays of two-dimensional images can be embedded on a two-dimensional sensor, right? Well, the problem there, of course, is each of those individual images is actually pretty small in a much larger raster. So dealing with the data is a very, very serious problem, both at capture and delivery and display. And fundamentally, getting around that problem is really where the active work in the industry is right now, I think. There's also just a little matter of optics, right? If you've got to keep all the light rays separate, that's sort of a challenging problem. That's also why there have been a variety of other approaches that kind of do a little end around and try to approximate light fields. So the good news on the data front, light fields are tremendously compressible. If you think about, say, a holographic window about this big, if you move your head right and left, you'll see that the image, as you sample across that holographic plate, doesn't change very much, right? Objects parallax a little bit, you get a little bit of specularity, a little bit of glimmer, but substantially the pixels are identical. So that's the good news. It means that as we crack this light field data problem, we're going to see compression ratios that are massively higher than what we get for 2D video. And in fact, in general, I would say our intuitions about the compressibility of images from 2D, those intuitions are wrong. Four-dimensional light fields are thousands of times more compressible than two-dimensional images. And that's really going to be what's driving the light field revolution in the future. Optics. Optics is still a major problem. Really, if we want to get light field-like approaches, we're going to have denser and denser and denser arrays until we're not really throwing away the relevant photons. again, it's going to really depend on subject matter. If you've got water in your shot, you got to have a denser array. There's no way around it. So we may see incremental stuff where certain light field cameras come out, and they work for most subject matter, and they fail for others. And then, of course, there's the BFH approach here. You can throw hundreds and hundreds of cameras in about a 50-centimeter ball, and you'll have pretty dense capture. That's sort of punting on the data problem, of course, but at least it's solving the optics problem. So we got a little bit of time for questions. My name is Ryan Damm. I'm starting a light field technology company. If you want to talk to me more about it, I'd love to talk. Otherwise, can we open the floor for questions? Data, you're saying like, okay, so the question is, if you had a two-dimensional image relative to a light field image of the same scene, how compressible is the light field? How much larger would the data be for the light field? I don't know is the short answer. The long answer is it depends on scene complexity. And scene complexity here refers specifically to the spatial structure in the scene, right? Imagine that you have all of your scenery is infinitely far away. Well, then the scene actually doesn't change as you move around laterally, right? So that's basically one-to-one. You could represent it more or less the same data footprint. As objects become closer, there's parallax, right? But it turns out a parallaxed object can actually be represented in not too many more bits, right? So in theory, it's, as always, there's theory and there's practice, right? In theory, they're very compressible. I couldn't give you a number. I'm hoping personally we're going to get to high video bit rates for compressed light fields. That should be the target, right? But again, that's going to fall apart for certain scenes. What kind of data format will the light fields be put into? I don't think that's been decided yet. OTOY has the Orbex format, which I know carries around light fields. I think it's in something like a very large raster with some sort of entropy encoding, but I'm just guessing. I've talked to the guys at Lytro, and I don't know what they're doing. So I would say it's an open question, frankly. Unsatisfying though it may be. I think we'll know more in about 6 months. Sure. The question was, can we talk about the relationship between the size of the array and depth of field? And refocusing. So refocusing is a light field function, right? So do you want to talk about like Lytro style cameras or like the VR arrays? Gotcha. Okay, so the question is really about if you can deliver refocusable views to a VR user, what kind of array size do you need? And the truth is it's not really about the array size, it's actually about your precision of capture. You have to have very fine-grained data about the ray angles and the ray positions. So when something's in focus, near field, that means that the direction of rays that are incident on a particular point change very rapidly with space, right? So the more fine-grained, the more precise your data is, the more accurately you can refocus things. In practice, there's really two scales of light fields right now. There's light fields inside of cameras where they have that type of data on the micron scale, basically, the size of these micro lenses. And then you've got large-scale light fields in which there's essentially no refocusability. We're assuming everything's in focus, and all we're really doing is capturing light rays, and we're not really concerned about very, very small spatial variations. As they get better, I think the two will converge, and you'll start to have large-scale light fields that have refocusability, but I haven't seen that demonstrated yet. That's a fine question. I got to put on like a wild speculation hat. I don't know. I haven't even had a demo. In practice, they talk about a light field display. I'm sorry. The question, by the way, was what is Magic Leap doing? Which wouldn't we all like to know? I have two ideas. One is that they're abusing the term light field. It's very possible, right? But more likely is they're doing something clever to create distorted wavefronts. So you could, in theory, do sort of this 4D addressable thing. If you had just, infinite number of pixels that you could deliver, lasers bouncing off of micromirrors, doing crazy stuff, you could deliver four-dimensional rays in a way that would approximate a light field. That'd be sort of like the digital version of it. My wild guess, and I've never actually written this down, so I feel like I'm walking out on a limb here. But my wild guess is they're doing something with silicon photonics, possibly some sort of 3D structure to emit distorted wavefronts off of the silicon itself. So when we talk about something being closer or farther away, we're actually talking about how the light, now we're talking about wavefronts, but basically how the rays propagate out. And if something's closer to you, they tend to propagate out with a steeper angle, right? It turns out that in the small scale, that's equivalent to a phase shift on the wavefront. So if they could do something really crazy on the silicon, like emit a small scale wave and locally kind of retard the wave, you could, in theory, create different focal planes. It's somewhat analogous to there's telescopic optics, adaptive optics, or the sort of undistort wavefronts that come through the atmosphere. So that's my wild speculation. It's worth exactly what you paid for it. Any other questions? Wild speculation you want me to? What's my company? What's the company? My company is my company is just me and a very good buddy who's a physicist, and we have some pretty strong ideas about the statistics of light fields, and we've done a lot of research. We will be working on codecs, encoders, decoders, and eventually camera systems. Sorry, a strong relationship between. You know, that's a very, so the question was, is there a relationship between an insect's eye and light fields? Not really. I mean, insects' eyes are really interesting in that they take a series of spatially separate, kind of low-res views of the world. How to describe this? The ommatidia in an insect's eye are all basically taking big ray bundles. Yeah, they're all separate, but each individual ommatidia is really only giving you, that's the little tiny lenses in a compound eye, actually only kind of give you one signal. They don't really tell you much beyond the intensity of light in a very particular ray bundle. But what the insects have is they have sort of neural circuitry. I'm out on a little bit of a limb here. My co-founder has been a neuroscientist, so he explained it to me once, and now I'm just completely butchering it. Sorry, Chris. It's something that they have neural circuitry behind that can do very, very fast processing on the differences between those ray bundles, and so they can very quickly infer object shape, direction of motion, and everything else. And that's why insects can react very quickly. It's fundamentally a different visual system architecture than humans. But it is sampling a light field, but apart from that, it's not, they're not terribly related. Question way in back? I can try. The question is, can I explain a little more about the phase shift for objects that are close? I should keep an eye on the time. How are we doing, Bruce? Last question. Okay. Last question is explain myself better on a previous question. Okay. So a distorted wavefront, how to really describe this here? If you take rays of light that are emitted from an object point and you connect them all along the same optical path distance, you have what's called a wavefront, right? It sort of represents all the photons. And this gets into the whole wave-particle duality thing, which is where my intuition starts to fall apart. But if you imagine that for a single object point, things radiate out in a sphere, okay? Typically, right, for most surfaces. When they're very far away, that sphere effectively spreads out so much it looks like a plane wave, right? It's functionally very flat. What I'm speculating about the phase shift stuff with Magic Leap is that they're able to do some sort of distortion where they're not just emitting plane waves or spherical waves off of a silicon chip, and they're doing something to do with phase shifting to simulate other shapes of the light field. If they did that across the RGB spectrum, you could in theory get sort of wildly different focal depths for every direction that you're looking. I wish I could kind of delete that whole line of thought because I'm sure it's totally wrong. I'm going to look like a jerk in a year when Magic Leap actually releases something, but that's my current guess. So, all right. So there it is. Thanks very much. All right. Thank you, Bruce.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Fantastic.